Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a recovering public servant and the Managing Director of the Good Trouble Group. Joining me today on Kaurna land are my two fellow recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston, Managing Director of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison.
So today we're kicking off a new series of episodes exploring recruitment, representation and the makeup of the Australian public service, issues which have been scrutinised for decades. We're going to ground this discussion in two landmark inquiries. First is the Coombs Royal Commission, which in 1974 was tasked with modernising the APS and addressing the systemic barriers that excluded women, Aboriginal Australians and other underrepresented groups. The second is the Thodey review, delivered in 2019, which revisited these themes, focusing on trust, innovation and workforce diversity in a modern public service. These are the two biggest reports into the Australian public service that exist. And both of them, both Coombs and Thodey, asked, who gets to be a part of the public service and how do we ensure that it reflects the community it serves? And with the recent release of the 2023-24 State of the Service report, we've got a fresh lens to examine these enduring questions. Danielle, let's start by unpacking how the findings in the State of the Service report align or diverge from the issues Coombs and Thodey explored and what it means for recruitment and diversity in today's APS.
Thanks, Alison. Look, there is so much to this, and one of the things I just want to say at the beginning is Coombs, Thodey and this State of the Service report are about the Australian public service, but in the I get the great chance to go through the states of the sector and State of the Service reports in the states and work on these issues in the states, and I would say there's very little different between in how these things operate. So I don't in any way want to think our Commonwealth colleagues think I'm picking on them. It's just that they had one excellent Royal Commission in 74 and then a very good inquiry that give us this good basis to have that conversation. So they've released the State of the Service report like they do every year. And I think, one place to start that is a little bit uplifting and very much shows how much time this stuff takes is the issue of women in the APS. And so we've seen some of the most significant progress there, but it also just reminds us how long it takes to get there. So the 2023-24 State of the Service report shows that women now make up 62% of the APS workforce and 52% of senior executive roles are held by women.
Woot woot.
Yeah, this is a huge shift from the 1970s, and one of the kickoffs for the then Whitlam government. The report was delivered after the end of the Whitlam government, but one of the reasons was about women in the public service, because we have to remember that in 66 they dropped the marriage bar. So it was in 66 they dropped the bar that married women could not have ongoing roles in the public service. And so then it gets to a couple of years later and they're like, well, what's that going to mean for the makeup of the public service? And they start holding a Royal Commission into the makeup of the public service. And so there's a huge shift from a marriage bar, 50 plus-ish years ago, to 52% of senior exec roles being held by women. So at the time of that structural barriers, Coombs calls for targeted recruitment, training programs, bringing more women, mentoring, recognising, and, Annabelle Crabb does beautiful writing on this, that merit. I think it's interesting that Coombs, I think, is one of the first in the Australian lexicon to write paragraphs about, what is merit and is merit a word for man? And so it wasn't enough to overcome that exclusion and arguing that equality of opportunity must be actively pursued, otherwise it's just a hollow promise. Then you get to 2019 when they do the Thodey review, which is really the next big review of the Australian public service, and there's still a big focus on gender equity and particularly about leadership and some of the pay parity issues in leadership. But the tone had changed considerably to emphasising flexible work arrangements and removing that barrier to career progression around caring responsibilities. So when we're in the late 60s and the early 70s and we're envisaging allowing the ladies into the public service and even to move their way through management and executive, that was still...
It's really only if they do it like men, though.
Exactly, right? And then you get to Thodey and they're like, we've done a pretty good job, we're doing well, but perhaps all of this kind of perhaps designing a workforce and family life where it was designed around the idea there was someone permanently at home doing a bunch of things isn't working out for us and is becoming a barrier. So that diverse leadership team that we need that's critical for solving complex public challenges needs to look more like the community. So you see this progression from Coombs to Thodey, and then you see in this state of the sector, that state of the service, that we've really made some of those gains, that the flexible work policies, equal parental leave, family violence support, they're all standard in the APS. There's still some way to go, and that thing of, dominating those lower ranks but being unrepresented in technical fields and certain SES level roles in different departments is something they're still working on. And that pay gap, once you get to negotiate contractually as opposed to necessarily always being in an EB, that's often where the pay gap starts to appear more obviously. So it's smaller than in the private sector, but it still exists. So there's been this huge amount of work that has led to outcomes, but not led to outcomes from like December to, January to December. It led to outcomes from the Whitlam government.
Over a 50-year time span, right?
So what does it tell us? It tells us, we can do it, but you've got to stick at it for a very long time. It's not a flight of fancy in a budget cycle. And that we're still working on these things 50 years later. So, but I did want to start there just because while it's easy to focus on what's left to do, I think it's worth celebrating that from 66 we got rid of the marriage bar. In 75, Coombs says, how about we, just let the ladies in? And then Thodey's like, well, I think we've still got some structural barriers and we keep moving through of those. So what's your thoughts on that long-term change in women in roles and in leadership over that period of time?
Oh, I have many. It's great progress. It is great progress, and we should acknowledge that. I guess I am curious about the breakdown of those women, of the pay of those women in senior executive roles. I'm convinced there is a pay disparity once you get into people negotiating for themselves as they are in those roles. I'm curious about the portfolio spread.
Girl jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Girl jobs.
Oh, so many girl jobs.
What do I... and we're being derisive, but... There is a perception that...
Not of the girl jobs,
not
just
of
to
the
be
girl
clear.
jobs, no. A perception that, obviously it wouldn't be weird or unusual to have a woman as head of HR or comms or
social
indeed
policy.
some of your social policy areas, but it starts to get a bit more unusual to have your chief economist be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my final reflection is... I do still think we are expecting those executive jobs to be performed in a certain way that is inconsistent with flexible work and family life. There was a point not that long ago where I realised that everyone else on the executive leadership team that I was a part of had a non-working spouse.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that I was the only one that had a working spouse, and I realised that was probably going to be a professional disadvantage to me at some point.
Yeah. I think just so thoroughly endorse that. Two disparate reflections. One is even how quickly the conversation has progressed. I remember it would have been 4 or 5 years ago, a certain minister said to a CE in the South Australian public sector that they thought that this women in leadership agenda had just gone a little bit too far. And I feel like that sort of comment probably wouldn't be made now. Although maybe it would, right? And maybe, I don't know if you guys saw, there was a really interesting cultural review done at Rio Tinto about how the experience, and I think it's important to surface that a little bit. I think we should, the fact that the Australian public service, for example, is 64%, is that what you said, Danielle?
62.
At the
62%
at the
women at the lower levels. I find that disturbing, and I think it says something about the ways in which we are failing young men in a different sense and in a different way of not setting them up for kind of traditional pathways of success either. So like I think I just want to kind of acknowledge there's a tension there, but it is nice that we are past a point, I think, where a minister would say out loud what was said out loud that time. On the question of like when I think about what it is to be, like Alison, you were often the only woman in a room. And I started my career as often the only woman in particular rooms, and I ended my career as it was vanishingly unlikely to see a man anywhere. That, just to be clear, marks my transition from working in defence to working in social policy. Right? It was like the little arc there. And I think both sets of rooms are disappointingly the poorer for not reflecting on that. There's a lack of diversity of approach. There's a lack of diversity of kind of skill sets brought into that conversation. Like I just think, I don't know, sorry, that's an inarticulate way of saying it. Prompts lots of thoughts for me, all of them a little bit nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, the one that just strikes me is how long it takes, right? And so when we start to talk about some of the things that I think are missing from Coombs, Thodey and the State of the Service report, the question is how long you have to dig in and how much you need to persist and persist. I think we've done lots of different things to get where we are, and we have to do lots of different things to keep moving, but they haven't all been the same thing. Like some of them have been ways of recruitment, some of them have been mentoring, some of them have been, I mean, I think we still live in a world where if a senior female stuffs up, there's a bit of an aha moment sometimes. I had cause only recently when someone was saying something to say, you know, isn't merit when we have as many mediocre women as we have mediocre men, and that the standard is the same. I don't, you know, when a similar thing, when a senior person who was a male gets caught in a similar kind of thing, I don't remember you saying, oh gosh, man. Yeah, it was like, and so we've got a way to go, but I do think that the biggest one is it just takes a really long time, a lot of persistence, and a lot of very different methods and mechanisms to get there.
All right, so let's transition then to another area where some progress has been made, but it's a long slog and requires many different mechanisms. First Nations representation in the APS. What does State of the Service tell us about this?
Look, another one where we see progress but are really grappling with the weight of history. So it highlights the State of the Service gives us some encouraging numbers. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation in the APS has increased to 4.1%. And the number in the SES bands has risen quite sharply from 54. I noticed that they switch.
They do a percentage.
Yep, they switch from percentage to cold hard numbers from 54 in 2022 to 85 in 2023. So that's a significant increase. So they are working towards their 5% target by 2030. I think that progress needs to be put into context. I know less about what we just talked about with women in the sense of where one would find pockets where it's been successful and whether there are whole portfolios where this is not perhaps making any traction and it's not really broken down well enough to make those assessments. When you go back to the 70s, Coombs was one of the first, as I've not found anything earlier that calls on greater, explicit calls for greater Aboriginal representation in the public service, and recognising that it was a part that it was a part of a strategy of reconciliation in its own way, and so that the systemic exclusion long denied First Nations people the opportunity to shape the policies and decisions that affected their communities. And he argued that a truly representative public service cannot exclude the voices of First Peoples. Now, when you think of how long ago that conversation was had, and I don't want to scurry off into a divergence on the voice referendum, I want to put it in the context mainly of if our public service doesn't include all the people it's making decisions for,
like the people it serves,
then it is not. It's not doing well. So Thodey kind of kept there was a thread like there was with women, and building on that and the need to reflect that diversity of leadership and that representation without support is a hollow achievement, which I think we've done better work on in recent years, but a long, long, long way to go around. Recruitment is a tiny part of the equation, and that retention, career development, cultural safety were equally critical. I can't remember if he mentioned it or if it's just everything else, but that whole sense of being the only First Nations person in the room, and so therefore you have to speak for hundreds of nations.
Carry the cultural load.
Carry the cultural load everywhere you are. So that progress is real but a bit uneven, and I would still say far too slow. I would say that if we go from the 70s to the 2019, we got further faster with women than we did with our First Nations kind of representation. Those SES numbers are encouraging, but big gaps still across, and retention seems to be a huge challenge. Those kind of your voice, tell us what you think surveys repeatedly tell us that First Nations employees feel kind of isolated and unsupported, and that those workplaces are not very culturally safe. So I think there's an intersection here where the policy and practice becomes quite critical, and that the cultural competency training and programs that we do, we think of them in the sense of making external policy as opposed to creating internal cultural safety so that we can attract, recruit, retain, grow, develop our First Nations workforces. And I don't think we've made as much progress on this or have tried as many different things as we have with women. We're still talking about the same structural barriers, whereas I feel like with the women in leadership, we have structural barriers, but they've become different over time, whereas this, I think we have actually not changed a lot of the structural barriers. So, I mean, do you find any of that surprising or in relation to First Nations employment in the public service?
I mean, I was thinking about, it's funny, like I feel so awkward speaking on behalf of people, but I think like I'm just thinking about a couple of conversations I've had in the last couple of weeks with Aboriginal public servants and then Aboriginal people leaving the public service. And I guess a couple of just consistent themes to point out in those conversations. So one, very much a sense of not just the only Aboriginal person in the room, but a sense that you will always be the only Aboriginal person in the room. And so like there's like, you know, and so some very practical kind of suggestions being made by those fabulous women around like, gee, it would be great if we could just have at least 2 roles in this particular division or team to do that.
According to Malcolm Gladwell's latest book, the magic number is 3. You need at least 3.
Brilliant. All right, I'm going to go back to these ladies and suggest that to them because that is like an excellent suggestion. So one, and talking about, and in particular, one of the women was talking about her very excellent experience of having more, of building a little mini kind of cohort and then kind of how she's played that out. So there's definitely that. 2 is both women I'm thinking of in particular talked about sort of almost having to do in creating a safe space for other Aboriginal people to come work in a non-Aboriginal specific role. They talked about needing to provide a lot of space for unpacking a lot of damage from like previous roles. And I just think like that's so true. And we all know what it's like when you have someone who's coming from like a really toxic, shitty workplace, how long it can take to give that person the courage and the confidence to kind of feel okay at work. And you know, they're not their best self for that first little bit of time. That's definitely not an Aboriginal specific experience. I can think of lots of friends who've arrived in places from crappy workplaces. And so just thinking about that as well. And then third, I think, Danielle, to your point about what the institutional framings are, a good news story that I heard the other day is that the social work registration something is talking about not requiring specific qualifications, and that they will be able to acknowledge and sort of professional experience. And I think we've talked about this question around qualifications before as a barrier. And it's not just a barrier to recruitment. It's like also how people justify paying really experienced, high-value people lots less money, and that's shit. So anyway, that's just like all of those things are just floating in my mind at the moment, but I'm not sure if that's helpful.
I guess my other reflection, again, not to speak on behalf of people who haven't had their lived experience, but I do think there's an expectation that when we bring First Nations people into the workforce, from the best intention, there is sometimes a lot of pressure on them to kind of, be culturally representative, be at every... in the same way that in a department where I was one of very few female executives, I was on every interview panel.
Yep.
It's this, it's actually this kind of additional imposition and workload on top of the tasks they are otherwise required to do that I don't think we always manage as carefully as we could. So let's talk about some other aspects of diversity, because State of the Service measures some but doesn't measure others, silent on others, like socioeconomic background. So, Danielle, what does it mean and why isn't class part of the conversation?
Look, just before we jump to that, they've got a few things that are new and different. So they've made notable progress in disability, culturally and linguistic diverse representation, and this is the first time they've added capturing data on neurodiversity. So the APS has a goal of 7% representation of people with disability, and they have a 5.4% kind of self-identifying, and they have a number of programs around an ability apprenticeship and graduate programs that are creating new entry pathways, which I think is really, really important. In the cold space, just over 25% of employees identify as culturally and linguistically diverse. That's a solid presence. The focus now needs to shift to kind of pushing that up through the ranks insofar as leadership positions, and where that influence is as opposed to the roles are. So I think they capture it well. I expect to see a focus on the pathway part of that going forward. I think it's really interesting and exciting that there was a focus this year on capturing data on neurodiversity. So for the first time, APS employees were asked about that, and 7.7% identified as neurodivergent, which I think is a huge step in recognising cognitive diversity as a key asset for innovation as opposed to anything else. I just think, here's the thing, like these dimensions of diversity, cold and neurodiversity in particular, weren't on the radar for Coombs. Thodey kind of touches on them, but it was quite different. Coombs was focused on gender and race, which was a very different casting of diversity, a very different kind of framing, and systemic barriers like education. Thodey was in that, expanded that to include that kind of modern recruitment and broader diversity targets. But even only, 5 years ago, neurodiversity wasn't even in that conversation at all. So this kind of shows how our understanding of diversity keeps changing and keeps kind of expanding. And we're measuring things now that 50 years ago just weren't on our agenda. But it also kind of raises another question of like, what are we missing today? If we were missing something before that's now been helpful, what elements of inclusion are we not capturing? And for me, it's class, and for me, it's socioeconomic background, which 50 years ago Coombs was interested in, and then in a touching on it way around the barriers to entry. But it was a public service that still had pathways for non-degree roles. And so whilst there was a strong sense in Coombs around the public service needing to represent the people, they had a much easier way to do that and a logical way to do that. And it was for a long time an opportunity for the brightest working class kids to come in straight from school into the public service, and a real tool for social mobility. I don't think, because we have not counted it and we don't count it and we can't report on it, what does that kind of say about how we see ourselves? And how does it when the state of the service starts to reflect back to us and it doesn't acknowledge first in family to have a white collar job, first in family to go to university, how are we actually being representative? And one of my other parts of that has always been, I have a feeling if we focused on class, you'd find your disability and your called measures would on their
naturally
own
tend to increase.
I think focusing on class as a measure would actually improve a huge number of your other diversity measures all on its own. And so, like, it's not new. It's not a new oversight. And it's such an Australian cultural attitude. Like, we pride ourselves on this kind of egalitarianism and this self-perception that we don't have class in Australia. Look, polls all the time find that if Australians do identify with a class, we're all middle class. The tiniest amount of posh, and a few who I suspect have families with strong, potentially even union histories. They sometimes identify as working class, but other than that, every single one of us is middle class in all of those polls. So, like, in the 70s, we could explicitly recognise structural inequality, and the barriers were not just race and gender, but also educational and the social capital needed to access the public service in the first place. Who writes that first application? What do you wear to an interview? How do you turn up? And
the application was like 10 pages of
so was mine.
That's insane.
It was worse than a Year 12 exam by a country mile. I had an auntie who was an APS 5 who told me what some of the words meant.
I had some older friends.
Yep. Look, Thodey in 2019 kind of touched on some of it, but more in that sense of diversity and that, we will struggle to get full breadth. But I think where his finding was helpful was the whole of service workforce strategy. So looking at systemic barriers in a kind of broader sense, shaping and particularly geography, because there's always that question with the Commonwealth of should they stick them all in Cairns or should they leave them all in Canberra? Slightly more nuanced debate, but
No, I think you really captured that totally perfectly.
I'm Team Cairns, in case anyone's wondering.
Danielle is happy to go B, a leading senior executive for the APS in Cairns.
I will also take the territory, but as a plan B. But even still, it's still very wishy-washy around, we should have a bit of someone from everywhere and a bit of everyone who looks different and a bit of everyone. And yet what we're not saying out loud is we should probably have some people who have received welfare benefits, who have used the NDIS, who have experience of government services, who know what the magic words are in the 10-page form, although I do think some of that has improved. I think that did peak in the late 90s and the early O's, the 29 selection criteria.
When we were applying.
Yep.
To know how old you are, Alice.
So there's no systemic effort at all to capture class representation. I think it really challenges our myth of a middle class identity to even talk about it. And I think if we don't start grappling with it, if we don't have the data, we're not going to know whether we're any good at this. What do you reckon? Do you think it's because it feels un-Australian, or is it a blind spot, or does it not matter as long as we have a mix of men and women and people from different racial backgrounds and include people with disability? Does it matter? Like, what do you think? Why are we better at other things than this?
I think we don't do it for that kind of cultural perception that you're talking about, but we can and we should, right? And one of the most striking things about the My School website when it was first implemented was that it would record for the first time the percentage of students at the school in different SES quartiles or quintiles. I think they're quartiles. So clearly it's possible. Right, there are other places where we appreciate that this data is important. So why don't we appreciate that it's important here? I guess my second observation is in all of these measures, right? And I know if you don't measure it, it doesn't matter. But actually, if we just focused on getting the right talent on the field, we wouldn't have any of these problems. We are squandering potential talent by not having sufficiently diverse public sector right? If you accept that talent is equally dispersed among men and women and into different cultural communities and in different socioeconomic backgrounds, why are we not focusing first on what would attract and retain the best people into the public service, which should, if done well, actually overcome some of those barriers? And I reflect here on Singapore, which, you know, whether you want this model is questionable, but identify some of their highest performing students from all areas in high school. They pay to send them to Oxford, and the deal is that they work then for the public service for a certain amount of years once they have finished their tertiary studies. Like, I think there's more and different ways we could look at how we do talent.
I mean, I think what you're exposing, there's a question, like, to answer your question, Danielle, so it's very explicit. Both Alison and I do not think it is good that that the Australian public service is not representative on a class basis. So I think we can just put that one to bed. The question is, I think, will measuring it be an important factor, or is identifying the entry pathways and thinking about making sure there are pathways from all different kinds of communities? Is that kind of, and of course it's not either or, right? Like, it's not either or. But when I think about so I really agree with you, Alison, on the kind of the pathways, maybe not the Singaporean going to Oxford, but, you know, Danielle has a million excellent suggestions on here that I'm hoping she's about to tell us about. But, you know, there are many excellent ways of thinking about putting in place better pathways. When I think about why we don't do it, I really think that part of it has been the reduction of lower classification jobs, that kind of both that certainly in state public services, we've really got rid of those APS1 kinds of roles. And so that entry level, nothing required role is a very unusual role. And then obviously there's something around the kind of commodification of the lower entry level roles as well. So when we think about the fact that contractors are now used and, you know, we kind of use labour hire instead of bringing on public servants to do some of those menial jobs, like the idea that the ABS employs people for the census on a seasonal basis is actually beautiful and quaint, but like strikes me as completely non-modern, right? Like, surely they would just use labour hire for that kind of grunt. So I think, you know, there's something about labour force dynamics that has done that. On the measuring it thing, the one thing I wonder is it something to do, in addition to our cultural lack of comfort with talking about class, there's something about what we know from data about children is that class is not just about the income of your parents, although that's very important. It's also about the education level of your parents. It's about the kind of richness and connectedness of your parents to other social networks, right? And I just wonder, like, are we deeply uncomfortable when you get employed in the APS to write down what did mum and dad do? Like, I just actually think there's like a kind of weirdness about asking adults to identify adults and how. Anyway, so I think that's
completely right.
You have to do your security clearance.
Oh my God. And then you have to say what grandma did and like, oh gosh. Yeah.
And the time she went to Japan in 1950.
Yeah. That's right. And a lot of value. Oh, sorry.
No. So I think that's incredibly true, is that it connects you back to your family, and not everybody is necessarily comfortable with that. And even if you are comfortable with it, your parents may also feel very differently about the idea that where you're at is about their data as well. So I think we should put a pin in what the ideas are, because I think the issue of recruitment and merit recruitment is worthy of an entire episode of Coombs, Thodey and like State of the Services. And I reckon Alison might have a little bit to say. I
have some out there ideas as well.
Yeah, I reckon she might have a bit to say. So I think that we should cover that in the next episode.
Well, on that note, till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.